Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Southern Mesopotamia, 3300 BC. Here, on the banks of the Euphrates River, stands a settlement larger than any other the world has known until now, the result of nearly 3,000 years of social development in this region. It was encircled by canals and irrigated farmland, so much so that it has been described as a Venice. In the middle of the desert, home to approximately 50,000 people, it dominated a hierarchy of smaller settlements whose resources it relied upon for its existence. At its very heart lay great ceremonial districts, dominated by monumental temples of the gods. It is here that we observe the emergence of a social hierarchy of unprecedented complexity, as well as the appearance of iconography depicting elite rulers and organized worship. Alongside all this, we see the development of a sophisticated temple economy, the management of which required new methods of record keeping, and perhaps even led to the birth of writing itself. Due to its vast size, the city possessed influence far beyond its borders and controlled a trade network that stretched north into Anatolia, east onto the Iranian plateau, and perhaps even west to the Nile Delta. The Uruk world system. In our previous series, we explored the communities of the late pre-Pottery Neolithic in the Levant, Syria, and Anatolia. In centers across the Near East, we saw the gradual decline of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Settlements now relied on domesticated plants and animals for survival. At the same time, ritual behavior began to change. People slowly moved away from specialized ceremonial sites, such as Göbekli Tepe, in favor of ritual buildings constructed within their local settlements. From the 8th millennium BC, we observed steady population growth in places like Ain in eastern Turkey, and Ain Ghazal in the Levant, both of which could number thousands of residents. In central Anatolia, this growth culminated in the appearance of the proto-city of Atalhik, whose densely packed buildings could house up to 8,000 people at its peak. Alongside these mega-settlements, we also saw the development of extensive trade networks and shared ritual practices, including the widespread decoration of human skulls. But these sprawling settlements did not last long. From the beginning of the 7th millennium BC, places like Ain and Ain Ghazal were gradually abandoned, and their populations moved to smaller settlements. Some sites persisted for several centuries longer. Talhik reached its peak around 6500 BC. Ultimately, however, ecological decline seems to have sealed its fate. People left, and new settlements were founded across the Levant, Anatolia, and the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. And with these settlements came new ways of life and new forms of ritual behavior. At first glance, the collapse of the large settlements of the late pre-Pottery Neolithic might have seemed like a huge step backward for the peoples of this region. But, as we saw with the example of the collapse of Natufian settlements 3,000 years earlier, there are no clear signs of a population decline in the Near East during this period. The broader trade networks of the time also appear to have survived, as evidenced by the ongoing trade in obsidian from Anatolia. Instead, people simply returned to living in a larger number of small settlements, under the conditions of an increasingly arid climate in the period after 6200 BC. These societies also began to master more diverse forms of agriculture, which allowed them to utilize a wider range of habitats. In areas that still received sufficient rainfall, people continued to rely on a mixed farming economy, while communities in drier areas became more dependent on pastoralism. Many of these later settlements might even have become semi-nomadic in nature. Herds of sheep and goats were driven across vast territories in search of rich pastures. Thus, by the second half of the 7th millennium BC, the people of this region had become dependent on one kind of farming lifestyle or another for survival. But we still have millennia to go before we see the emergence of the world's first advanced civilizations. To demonstrate this, Let us once again recall the criteria we laid out for civilization at the beginning of our first episode. First, we expect civilizations to be characterized by a dense urban environment dependent on a mixed system of agriculture. In addition, these complex centers are marked by the practice of monumental construction, a visible social hierarchy, and bureaucratic record-keeping systems, such as writing. Throughout the two previous series, we indeed saw the emergence of societies fully dependent on the management of domesticated crops and animals across much of the Near East. Alongside this, we also saw the development of complex ritual behavior related to death and burial, as well as numerous pieces of evidence for monumental construction in places like Göbekli Tepe and Jericho. Finally, we saw the appearance of large-scale settlements across the Near East that carried the prototype of urban life. But despite all this, the societies we see at the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic appear to have remained largely egalitarian. There are no clear signs of an elite class, nor is there a major division of labor between farmers and more specialized workers. And besides simple trade and exchange networks, there are as yet no signs of an organized bureaucracy or writing. But in the course of our latest series, we will see the emergence of these final criteria in a region that has so far barely been mentioned in this cycle. It is time to leave the world of the pre-pottery Neolithic behind and turn our attention to the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. For it is in this region, which now comprises parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, and the southeastern fringes of Turkey, that we observe the emergence of increasingly complex societies during the 7th millennium BC. The exact chronology of the early cultures of Mesopotamia is difficult to track, not helped by the fact that most of them are known only from a handful of excavated sites. We can say that, in the second half of the 7th millennium BC, a series of overlapping cultures developed across northern Mesopotamia. These societies were characterized by small agricultural villages, housing perhaps no more than a couple of hundred people. Here, residents subsisted on a diverse diet of domesticated animals, such as pigs, sheep, goats, and cattle, alongside crops like emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, and legumes. Alongside this, there is some evidence of hunting wild prey, such as gazelle, onager, and oryx. Though they made up at best a small part of the local diet, the exact agricultural methods employed by each of these cultures also appear to have varied, depending on local geography. In the more northerly reaches, we see the emergence of a culture known as the Hasuna. Here, communities lived among fertile rolling lands, where rain-fed dry farming was sufficient to sustain their settlements. However, further south, communities received either marginal or insufficient rainfall for non-irrigated farming to be reliable. But despite this, we see the emergence of small agricultural villages in this region along the edges of the two rivers dominating Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and the Tigris, known as the Samara culture. These peoples applied a radically different approach to agriculture compared to those living further north. By digging simple canals and irrigation systems, these societies could artificially supply their fields with enough river water to allow crops to grow. These water management systems had appeared earlier in areas such as the Levant, but here they proved vital for sustaining agricultural societies, and with them, humanity was soon able to spread into regions that until then had been only occasionally inhabited. In addition to the agricultural lifestyle, the Hasuna and Samara cultures are marked by the production of a new type of storage container. In our last series, we detailed the emergence of pottery in places like Atalhik, where recognizable shards dating to the beginning of the 7th millennium BC were discovered. Similar vessels appear in the societies of northern Mesopotamia around the same time. As far as we know, this early pottery was hand-molded. Coils of clay were built up on a pre-prepared base to facilitate this process. These vessels were likely made on a simple mat or even inside another container, allowing them to be rotated more easily. Over the millennia, these rotating devices became increasingly sophisticated, eventually leading to the appearance of simple hand or foot-powered devices that would constitute the earliest potter's wheels. Once finished, these pots were fired in a kiln or furnace and then used for a wide range of functions, such as cooking, storing goods, or even transporting them over long distances. And while the earliest Neolithic pottery was often plain or simply decorated, by the time of the Hassuna and Samara cultures, pottery was already being painted with complex linear and geometric patterns, as well as recognizable animal motifs. Over time, these designs continued to be perfected, a practice that often allows archaeologists to track social changes over long periods. Alongside the Hassuna and Samara, another pottery culture emerged in the north at the end of the 7th millennium BC. This culture, known as the Halaf, apparently originated further west, in the rain-fed regions of northern Syria and southeastern Turkey. During the 6th millennium BC, this culture spread across much of the former Hassuna range. Unfortunately for us, the settlements of this culture remain less studied than the later societies of the region, and as a result, our understanding of Halaf society remains limited. However, we do have some evidence of distinctive local practices. To begin with, many Halaf settlements were founded on new lands rather than on the site of existing ones, indicating rapid population growth in northern Mesopotamia during this period. As far as we know, this expansion of the population probably coincides with two important agricultural advancements. The first of these is the appearance of draft animals and early forms of plows, which allowed for more efficient cultivation of the fertile soils of these regions. The second was a possible shift in the human diet in favor of dairy products, which would allow these settlements to support a larger number of children at any given time. Despite population growth, the expansion of this culture was not accompanied by the widespread emergence of large settlements, as had been the case in the previous millennium. On the contrary, most Halaf settlements were small, scattered villages with a population of a couple of hundred people. These settlements are also characterized by a return to a mixture of rectangular dwellings and larger circular buildings known as tholoi, the exact purpose of which remains uncertain. As in the preceding Hassuna and Samara cultures, Halaf settlements are marked by the production of elaborately painted pottery, as well as the ongoing supply of large quantities of obsidian from the north, for the manufacture of tools, weapons, and jewelry. Beyond material culture, the exact social and ritual dynamics of Halaf settlements remain unclear. While larger buildings are found at these sites, there are no clear examples of either elite dwellings or ritual structures. One of the few exceptions was Tal Arpachir. Here, a complex of burnt buildings connected to a circular tholos was discovered. It is suggested that it may have been the residence of a local chieftain. Another possible clue is the expanded use of stone stamp seals found in all Halaf villages. We briefly mentioned these stamps in the last episode, when we saw their appearance in the upper layers of a tauhik. Simple geometric patterns and scenes were carved onto these seals, which left a recognizable impression when pressed into clay. Each of these patterns was apparently associated with an individual or group, and was used in Halaf communities to seal the lids of containers, such as pots and baskets. In the case of pots, which were closed by tying a piece of cloth around the neck, a wet lump of clay was plastered around the cord and knot, after which the seal impression was applied. Once dry, the contents of the pot could not be accessed without breaking the seal. The expanded use of such seals in Halaf settlements is interpreted by researchers as evidence that issues of personal property were becoming increasingly important to their inhabitants. One theory holds that a significant portion of the population consisted of herders, who spent a lot of time away from the village tending to flocks. In their absence, property could be kept in communal storehouses, and clay seals were used to identify the owners. As for ritual behavior, during this period, we know very little. The only clue is the presence of mysterious headless female figurines found at Halaf sites, like the Venuses of the Upper Paleolithic and the seated woman from Italic. These figurines possess emphasized female characteristics, including enlarged breasts and hips. Archaeologists have tried to link these figures to fertility motifs, but this is far from certain. Thus, by the end of the 7th millennium BC, agricultural societies had spread widely across northern Mesopotamia. However, until this point, the same could not be said of the southern Mesopotamian plains, which apparently remained sparsely populated. From about 6000 BC, the situation changed. Small farming villages began to spread across the region. These settlements belonged to the first known culture of southern Mesopotamia, the Ubaid culture. Currently, there are two main theories about exactly how the Ubaid culture originated. The most widely accepted and oldest theory states that around 6000 BC, the climate in this region was hot and arid, not unlike the climate of modern-day Uruk, as in the regions inhabited by the Samara culture in the north. Rain-fed farming was impossible here, and settlements were limited to narrow strips of land along the edges of the Euphrates and Tigris. The flat nature of the Mesopotamian plain also meant that both rivers had very shallow channels that could shift over time, requiring periodic relocation of settlements. Furthermore, both rivers are subject to strong annual floods fed by winter rains in the north. At first glance, this flooding could act as a natural form of irrigation. In ancient Egypt, the Nile played a similar role, flooding in late summer and leaving moist, highly fertile soil on the banks just in time for the planting season. However, unlike the Nile, the Mesopotamian flood arrived in the middle of the spring growing season, and the rising waters could easily destroy young plants before harvest. Finally, in the Persian Gulf region, the Tigris and Euphrates break up into vast marshlands, which also made farming difficult. The result of all this was that agriculture in southern Mesopotamia required the creation of sophisticated river water management systems. The first attempts at creating such systems appeared in the east, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, as well as along the edges of the marshes around the Persian Gulf. These irrigation efforts intensified by 6000 BC when water management systems emerged that allowed agriculture to spread onto the southern plain. These systems consisted of a network of artificial canals and reinforced dikes that allowed farmers to release exactly as much river water onto their fields as was required for cereal growth. Thanks to these systems, the potential of the fertile soil deposited by these rivers over the previous millennia was finally unlocked. From this point on, the region entered the Ubaid period, during which the first permanent settlements were founded across southern Mesopotamia. As we have already mentioned, this theory remains widely accepted among archaeologists. However, it relies heavily on the idea that the ancient climate of the region was similar to the modern one. Indeed, in recent decades, studies have emerged challenging this idea. Specifically, a major ecological study conducted by Dr. Jennifer Cornell showed that the landscape of much of southern Mesopotamia in the 6th millennium BC consisted of vast marshes and wetlands, rather than deserts. According to this model, the rainfall regime in this region was still dictated by the Indian monsoon system, and the area only began to dry out after this system shifted southward, starting in the 4th millennium BC. If this ecological model is correct, the problem for much of the region may have been an excess of water, rather than a lack of it. In areas near the Gulf, potential agricultural land among the surrounding marshes was extremely scarce. This model also suggests that the modern flat appearance of the region is the result of long-term accumulation of river alluvium, and that the actual ground level in the 6th millennium BC was much more variable. Nevertheless, conditions in the north of the alluvial plain, even according to this model, were drier, making irrigation in that area more important. If this alternative model is correct, then many ideas about the origins of agriculture in this region may require revision. For now, let us turn to what we can say with more certainty about the Ubaid culture. As with the preceding Halaf culture, our knowledge of early Ubaid period sites is limited. The main reason is that excavations of settlements from this era are often hindered by deep layers of silt and cultural deposits that have accumulated over them. In the subsequent millennia, Nevertheless, a number of early sites have been excavated, providing insight into the first settlements of that era. As far as we know, these settlements first appeared along the banks of rivers and coastal marshes in the south. In these places, mud brick villages were founded on so-called turtlebacks, areas of dry arable land rising above the surrounding marshes. Over time, these areas were built up either through the accumulation of domestic waste or with the help of artificial materials, such as layers of reed mats. From there, Ubaid-type settlements gradually spread to the rest of the southern plain. Here, sites such as Tel al-Waili, Tel Uqair, and the eponymous Tel al-Ubaid are characterized by rectangular mud brick buildings, and include distinct storage rooms and pottery kilns. Unlike most Halaf period settlements, which are characterized by weak social distinctions, there is evidence that in Ubaid communities, certain individuals may have already possessed higher social status, as indicated by the larger houses in which they lived. In addition to this early elite, we also see evidence of the emergence of a public building at the center of Ubaid period settlements. These buildings, usually described by archaeologists as temples, appear to have been the physical center of Ubaid villages, acting simultaneously as a place of collective worship and as a hub for the storage and distribution of grain and other agricultural commodities. The importance of these temple buildings was such that they were successively rebuilt and improved throughout the Ubaid period, evolving into increasingly grand ritual complexes. To find the best studied example of such structures, we must look to the southernmost fringes of Mesopotamia. It was here, at the site of Eridu, that a temple was found which is often considered the oldest Ubaid temple, dating to approximately the middle of the 6th millennium BC. This building was constructed over an earlier structure of uncertain purpose, and consisted of a single mud brick room, with a simple altar and an offering table covered in ash. At the time of its founding, the level of the Persian Gulf was much higher than it is today, and the building originally stood among coastal wetlands. Over the next 3,000 years, 15 more structures were erected on this site, with many of them reconstructed directly over their immediate predecessors. Gradually, the size of these buildings increased until a recognizable series of tripartite buildings situated on terraces formed in the upper layers. These structures consisted of a T-shaped hall leading to a central hearth and an altar, flanked by a series of smaller rooms and niches. In these later layers, a large quantity of fish bones was discovered, along with abundant ash and coiled clay loops resembling snakes. These apparent offerings to the deity or deities worshipped at this site draw comparisons to the later Sumerian god Enki, who was worshipped here approximately 3,000 years later. However, while fish is a symbol often associated with Enki, similar offerings are found in other Ubaid-era temples. The identification of the earliest buildings at this site as temples is also far from undisputed, and some archaeologists suggest that this sequence of buildings was not necessarily continuous. As a consequence, we cannot say with certainty whether the deities honored here in the 6th millennium BC were the same as those mentioned in the oldest written sources of the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. It is more likely, however, that the very setting of the temple at Eridu influenced later associations of Enki with marshes and other aquatic landscapes. Beyond Eridu, we also know that the tripartite layout characteristic of late Ubaid-era temples remained a common design for both ritual and residential buildings for another millennium, as did their characteristic appearance with buttresses and niches. So who exactly oversaw the construction of these ritual buildings and irrigation systems? While there is currently no clear consensus on this issue, one theory holds that early development and irrigation works were coordinated by local chieftains and elite families. According to archaeologist Mark van de Uruk, there is evidence that within each community, a single household stood out with administrative control over grain stores, through which they could derive local power. People from these households were likely also involved in the day-to-day management of the temple, given the building's role as a distribution center. and may have functioned as the earliest priests of Mesopotamian society. At the same time, we must recognize that if Ubaid societies were governed by an elite class, there are few signs of this in the funerary traditions of the time, which mostly consisted of communal cemeteries. Similarly, there is little evidence of the ostentatious display of wealth associated with later elites. Other archaeologists theorize that power in the Ubaid period may have been more rooted in family alliances and control over local resources than in the acquisition of exotic materials. The emergence of this Ubaid culture was initially limited to the southern plain of Mesopotamia. In the north, the Halaf material culture continued. By the end of the 6th millennium BC, it had spread across much of the Near East. Halaf-style pottery is found at sites from the Levant in the west to the Zagros mountain regions in the east. Then, around the middle of the 5th millennium BC, Halaf began to give way to Ubaid, which expanded to cover most of its range in northern Mesopotamia. While early theories presented this as a sudden land grab by Ubaid peoples from the south, it is now known that in most areas this transition was gradual, with transitional pottery forms appearing between the two. Around the same time, Ubaid-style artifacts appear along the fringes of the Zagros mountains, including a large amount of elaborately painted pottery. Ubaid-influenced pottery also appears during this period on the Susiana plain to the east, including at the local settlement of Susa. Finally, Ubaid-style pottery has been found at approximately 50 different sites along the Persian Gulf, suggesting that long-distance maritime trade networks already existed by the 5th millennium BC. The appearance of this high-quality pottery likely coincides with the spread of improved production methods during the Ubaid period. In particular, the Ubaid period is thought to have marked the appearance of the earliest forms of the potter's wheel. These early wheels, or tournettes, were simple devices turned by hand or foot, which allowed for the faster production of high-quality pottery, compared to previous hand molding methods. Thus, by the end of the Halaf and Ubaid periods, we can already see many of the advancements that would become hallmarks of Mesopotamian culture. In addition to the centralized temples of Ubaid society, we see evidence of the expanding use of stone seals in trade and bureaucracy throughout Mesopotamia, alongside developed trade networks radiating far beyond the channels of the Tigris and Euphrates. The appearance of the first potter's wheels also foreshadowed the emphasis on mass production observed throughout Mesopotamian society in subsequent millennia. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, the introduction of sophisticated irrigation and water management systems during this period could have made agriculture more reliable in southern regions, where rainfall was insufficient. In addition to these more stable agricultural systems, irrigation efforts may also have formed a complex system of canals across much of southern Mesopotamia, facilitating the mass transportation of goods and raw materials by boat. There is no clear break between the practices of the late Ubaid period, at the end of the 5th millennium BC, and the practices of subsequent millennia. Instead, we see the rapid development of existing cultural traditions, as well as the emergence of increasingly dense and urbanized societies throughout southern Mesopotamia. Starting around 4200 BC, the period known as the Uruk period would be characterized by even more intense growth in both settlement size and number across the Near East. The Uruk period presents a number of challenges for archaeologists. First, only one major site of this period has been substantially excavated in southern Mesopotamia, and even then, almost all available information comes from archaeological layers dating to the second half of the 4th millennium BC. In contrast, most of the evidence for early and middle Uruk societies comes from excavations in northern Mesopotamia. Studying these communities, alongside surface surveys conducted by archaeologists across southern Mesopotamia, we see that both the size and number of settlements were increasing sharply. By the end of the Ubaid, the exact reasons for this expansion remain unclear. One argument is that from the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, the climate of Mesopotamia became increasingly dry, and more people were drawn from their regions toward larger, more economically stable settlements. At the time, these large settlements were still a largely untested concept and faced significantly higher rates of disease, sanitation problems, and inequality. Despite this, these sites continued to grow. By the late Ubaid, communities in northern Mesopotamia were characterized by a series of widely spaced urban centers, often surrounded by a ring of smaller settlements. In comparison, settlements in southern Mesopotamia were both smaller and more evenly distributed across the countryside. This rapid population growth continued throughout the early Uruk period, with growth rates seemingly outpacing what could be provided by local reproduction. One possibility is that either the semi-nomadic peoples of the region were increasingly transitioning to sedentarism, or new peoples were migrating to Mesopotamia from surrounding regions. By the Middle Uruk period, around 3600 BC, North Mesopotamian centers such as Tel Brak and Hamuka had expanded significantly, with Tel Brak in particular growing to an unprecedented area of 130 hectares. In central Mesopotamia, much of the growing population also concentrated in 3 large centers, each of which could occupy 30 to 50 hectares. However, when we look at the southernmost parts of Mesopotamia, we see a very different picture. It is here that we observe the increasing concentration of the region's population in a single center of unprecedented scale, called by many archaeologists the world's first city. The rapidly expanding site of Uruk during the 4th millennium BC coincides with major changes in the functioning of urban societies, formed by the apparent merger of 2 Ubaid-era settlements on the banks of the Euphrates. Uruk shows unprecedented population growth. In the late Ubaid period, the site was apparently comparable in scale to other settlements in southern and central Mesopotamia, such as its contemporaries Nippur and Eridu. However, by the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, Uruk had already expanded to an area of about 70 hectares. By 3600 BC, its size reached 250 hectares, far surpassing any contemporary settlement across the entire Near East. The exact reasons for such rapid expansion are unclear. Perhaps the city was simply located on a more fertile stretch of the Euphrates, or it was aided by a highly developed canal system that provided larger agricultural surpluses and trade links than other southern settlements. Whatever the reason, the development of this massive settlement caused a major restructuring of urban centers in its vicinity. Unlike other sites we see in southern Mesopotamia, which have a maximum of one supporting network of smaller villages, by the middle of the Uruk period, the city already stood atop a recognizable 4-tier hierarchy of hamlets, villages, and towns, upon whose resources and tribute it relied for its existence. By the late Uruk period, the site's area reached approximately 400 hectares, and it is believed that more than 80,000 people could have lived within its territory. Its pull was such that by the end of the 4th millennium BC, entire areas of central Mesopotamia appear to have become depopulated, as more people concentrated in the south. The development of such a mega-settlement was not unprecedented in the history of the Near East. We have already examined similar centers appearing in the pre-Pottery Neolithic, such as Atalhik, Ain, and Ain Ghazal, which also featured high population densities numbering in the thousands. However, there are 3 main points in which Uruk differs from these sites. The first is its sheer scale. It occupies an area roughly 30 times larger than that of Atalhik at its peak. The second is a deep differentiation of functions observed in various districts of the city. It is here for the first time that we see evidence of public meeting places, markets, specialized production centers, and monumental temple quarters. In contrast to the tightly packed buildings of Atalhik, we also see evidence of planned streets and alleys. And thirdly, unlike the mega-settlements of the pre-Pottery Neolithic, the increased population density in Uruk coincides with a growing level of inequality among its residents. This distinction in status is best traced in the increased diversity of house sizes in Uruk and other settlements of this period, as well as in the emergence of a recognizable hierarchy of officials and professions. It is the combination of these factors that leads many archaeologists to distinguish Uruk from preceding sites and call it the first true city in the world. So how did life function in this city? For a significant part of Uruk's existence, we cannot be certain. As we have already mentioned, excavations of these districts have been mainly limited to the late Uruk period, and as a result, we still remain in the dark regarding many aspects of the city's early development and social structure. Another problem is that of the excavations conducted in Uruk. Most were limited to the two temple quarters lying at its heart. However, it is clear from these finds that most of the city's daily activity revolved around these centers, which served as ritual and economic hubs, much like their Ubaid-era predecessors. The most notable of these two centers was the Ina district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna. A series of monumental buildings was erected here throughout the Uruk period. Although the composition of this area at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC is still unclear, two ritual structures dating to the Middle Uruk period have been discovered. The first of these structures, the limestone temple, follows a modified form of the tripartite plan we saw in Eridu and contains a central T-shaped hole. However, what sets this building apart is its unprecedented size. Measuring approximately 76 by 30 meters, this temple was larger than the Parthenon in Athens and was situated on a low terrace, about 2 meters high, which contained the remains of an earlier Ubaid-era temple. The second building, known as the Stone Cone Mosaic Temple, is smaller in scale but possesses a unique layout combining a tripartite design with a series of mysterious rectangular and L-shaped corridors. These two buildings were primarily constructed of valuable limestone and bitumen. The former, it seems, was brought from a site located 60 kilometers to the east. In addition to these valuable materials, the exteriors of the temples were decorated with geometric pattern mosaics, composed of stone cones in red, black, or white. Over the next few centuries, new terraces and mud brick temples were added to the space between these buildings, along with a large courtyard and a series of freestanding columns. These columns, which would later become a regular feature of Mesopotamian architecture, were also decorated with cone mosaic reminiscent of the mosaic of the earlier temples. Mosaics executed in this manner have been found at other Uruk-era sites outside southern Mesopotamia, and were, apparently, a common element of the artistic practice of the time. These terraces and their associated buildings stood until approximately the late Uruk period, when they were suddenly leveled to the ground. During this period, which apparently coincided with a change in the belief system in Uruk, one large terrace was built, incorporating the remains of previous temples. Atop this terrace, a series of new temples of even greater scale was erected, alongside a number of large buildings that could have been used as public assembly houses and distribution centers, as well as residences for officials. In addition to this younger quarter, Uruk also housed a temple known as Kalab, or the Anu district, named after the sky god, who was worshipped here in subsequent millennia. From the early Uruk period, this site was occupied by a sequence of massive mud brick terraces built atop a series of buildings, the earliest of which dates to the late Ubaid. By the Middle Uruk period, this terrace had reached a height of about 12 meters and had turned into a polygonal structure, measuring approximately 45 by 50 meters. Although it is known that earlier buildings identified as temples were built atop this platform, the largest and most remarkable structure crowning this structure is a building radiocarbon dated to approximately 3450 BC, known as the White Temple. The walls of this building still stand to a height of about 3 meters. It followed a standard tripartite plan measuring approximately 18 by 22 meters. In addition to its elevated position, this temple was covered with a layer of white gypsum plaster, which reflected sunlight, making it visible for many miles around. The repeated reconstruction of these extensive temple quarters required both a high degree of social organization and a vast amount of labor. According to archaeological estimates, the construction of just the large buildings in the Ina district would have required the labor of about 15,000 workers. working up to 10 hours a day for 5 years. And while this construction appears to have been primarily ritual in nature, it may also have served to strengthen social ties between the temple and the people of Uruk. Furthermore, the very scale of the construction suggests that an element of coercion may have been present in these building projects, especially regarding workers dependent on the temple for survival. Regardless of how these construction works were carried out, the result was an awe-inspiring complex of buildings, access to which was restricted by surrounding walls. Setting aside the ritual architecture, what would life have been like inside these temples? Well, looking at their layout, it is perhaps best to imagine these temple buildings as exaggerated houses for the gods. Indeed, private residences throughout the Uruk period resemble the tripartite structure of the known ritual buildings of this period. Additional evidence for this can be seen in later worship practices in the 3rd millennium BC. In that period, it was believed that gods had two aspects, existing simultaneously in the heavens and in the form of their cult statue. Such statues were cared for as if they were real people. They were provided with temples for housing, clothing, and feasts for consumption. While we cannot be certain that gods were worshipped in this way throughout the 4th millennium BC, a sign that this may have been exactly the case is an artifact found in the Ina district, dating to the late Uruk period. This artifact is a nearly life-sized head of a woman carved from white marble. Besides being one of the earliest known anatomically accurate depictions of a human face, it has been suggested that this image was part of a cult statue of the goddess Inanna herself, with the rest of the statue consisting of wood or precious metals. However, this identification is far from certain, and it is also possible that this structure was part of the facade of a ritual building, rather than an individual statue. It should also be noted that the frequent redesign of both temple quarters throughout the Uruk period likely indicates significant social and cultural changes during the city's existence, and such continuity with later ritual practices may not be possible. So while we have no direct evidence that gods were worshipped in the form of cult statues in this period, we know that complex ceremonies for offering ritual tribute, which included livestock, agricultural products, and possibly other luxury goods, were held inside their temple complexes. Evidence of this activity can be found in another remarkable example of craftsmanship discovered from this period. Standing about 3 feet high and weighing nearly 600 pounds, the Walker vase provides a possible snapshot of the daily affairs of the Ina temple quarter. In the late Uruk period, its register's tiers depict scenes of a hierarchical procession toward the temple, with agricultural products and valuable minerals. On the upper register, this tribute is presented to a richly dressed woman who stands taller than most other characters in the scene, and behind her stands a reed bundle symbol associated with the goddess Inanna. The most generally accepted theory among archaeologists is that this figure represents Inanna herself, though other theories identify her as a priestess, an official, or even just a keeper of the temple storehouses. Compared to previous millennia, Uruk society also apparently placed more emphasis on mass production. This can be seen in part in the increased appearance of new types of pottery throughout this period. As we mentioned earlier, the preceding Ubaid era likely saw the first appearance of the potter's wheel or tournet. In the Uruk period, we continue to see improvements in wheel design, as evidenced by an increase in the number of closed vessel forms, such as jugs, decanters, and bottles. However, unlike the pottery of previous cultures, most of these containers lack any noticeable decoration, possibly indicating a priority of rapid production over appearance. By far the most characteristic pottery found in Uruk and at other sites of this period are the handmade beveled rim bowls. These simple containers were apparently molded in forms which allowed them to be produced rapidly in huge quantities in specialized areas, and then discarded after a short period of use. In addition to these pottery quarters, similar areas dedicated to metalworking were found, while vast amounts of textiles were apparently centrally produced by women in temple centers. Alongside this mass production of goods, we also see evidence of finely crafted items, such as the aforementioned Walker vase or the mosaic panels in the inner quarter. And along with these items, it is in this period that we first see signs of a new type of skillfully carved tool that demonstrates the importance of personal property and power in late Uruk society. As we discussed earlier, the use of stone stamp seals is well attested in settlements of the Halaf and Ubaid cultures, where they were likely used to identify objects associated with specific individuals or groups. However, in the late Uruk period in southern Mesopotamia, these stamps were replaced by small cylindrical stone objects known as cylinder seals. Like stamp seals, these items contain a carefully executed mirror image of a scene that can be quickly impressed onto clay with a single motion. However, compared to stamp seals, the space available on these cylinder seals was much larger, allowing for the inclusion of more detailed scenes associated with a specific owner or office. This expanded versatility of design was particularly important as Uruk society became more complex, as a greater number of individual offices and officials needed to be identified at any given time. The individual scenes on these seals also provide us with some insight into daily life. Many of them depict domestic animals in front of temple buildings, figures working in what look like workshops, and women engaged in pottery making and weaving. Like their predecessors, the stamp seals, these cylinders were also used to seal goods and storehouses, as well as to confirm transactions. Moving beyond the role of stamp seals, cylinder seals would soon become a key part of extensive correspondence and record-keeping in the Near East, a role they would maintain for millennia. For a long time, archaeologists believed that these types of social development were unique to Uruk. However, in recent decades, a reassessment of data from centers in northern Mesopotamia has shown that sites such as Tel Brak, Hamuka, Teepgora, and Arslan-Tep also displayed signs of growing urbanization. At the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, in Tel Brak, for example, there is a hierarchy of surrounding settlements similar to the one that emerged around Uruk. Although the site itself is smaller in size, excavations have also uncovered evidence of the specialized use of spaces, characteristic of early urbanization. In a neighboring mound to the southeast, traces of a workshop and kilns intended for the mass production of pottery were found, while the central mound of the settlement shows evidence of more than one zone of monumental construction. In an area called TW, a monumental mud brick structure was excavated, similar to the temple buildings of the late Ubaid. Later layers of this area include a non-residential structure known as the niched building, whose courtyard appears to have been a site for organized feasting. In subsequent periods, the structures around this courtyard were replaced by more domestic buildings, which the excavation director Jeff Embling suggests may have constituted an elite residence. Finally, an even more complex ritual building was discovered at this site, the earliest layers of which date back to at least the first half of the 4th millennium BC, known as the Eye Temple because of the thousands of small idols found in its layers. It is now recognized as a complex of buildings constructed on high platforms. A number of other sites in northern Mesopotamia also show signs of urbanization at this time, including their own traditions of monumental construction, specialized craft, and complex administrative behavior carried out with the help of stamp seals. Moreover, the culture of the north during this period appears to have remained distinct from the south, as seen in the preservation of its own pottery styles. However, there is evidence in this region that the transition to urbanization may have been associated with a greater degree of conflict than observed in the south. Evidence for this is found in mass graves discovered at Tel Brak dating to 38,003,600 BC. These graves contain dozens of bodies, many of which belong to healthy adults, and the scattered nature of the remains hints at violent deaths. While there is currently no evidence of a comparable level of violence in southern Mesopotamia, it should be noted that scenes of war frequently appear on Uruk-era cylinder seals, including the capture of prisoners and slaves. Thus, northern Mesopotamia was clearly experiencing a period of population growth and urbanization throughout the first half of the 4th millennium BC. However, From approximately the middle of that millennium, the growth of southern settlements seems to overtake the northern ones. The exact reason for this is still unclear. One theory holds that the channels of the Euphrates and Tigris in this area may have shifted, forcing the population to change their settlement patterns. Another version suggests that the climate of Mesopotamia was becoming more arid at this time, leading to a reduction in rainfall in the irrigated regions of the south. This change might have led to the drying out of marshy areas, perhaps releasing more land for agricultural use. In the north, however, the drier climate could have limited the ability of cities to support a growing population. Around this time, we see evidence of a destruction layer at Hamuka, where the settlement was suddenly destroyed as a result of an assault marked by thousands of sling bullets. The population of Tel Brak also appears to have declined, coinciding with a series of major fires at the site. Shortly thereafter, the characteristic material culture of the south appears at the site, and the late levels of the Eye Temple are rebuilt using Uruk-style cone mosaics. Around the same time, we see the appearance of beveled rim bowls, cone mosaics, and cylinder seals at a large number of sites across western Syria and southeastern Turkey. Finally, this same material culture appeared in the east at Susa, and Uruk-style artifacts begin to be found at a number of sites across the Iranian plateau. Early theories held that the spread of Uruk cultural elements beyond southern Mesopotamia was a sign of an informal military empire, where the city forcibly expanded its power over other emerging centers of the Near East. Indeed, in many places, Uruk material culture replaces local traditions, and new Uruk-influenced settlements appear in previously uninhabited areas. These new sites, described as colonies, include places such as Tel Sheikh Hassan, Jebel Aruda, and the fortified city of Habuba Kabir on the Euphrates. However, more modern research argues that, instead of wielding a military empire, the Uruk elites may have exerted cultural and economic influence over other cities in southern Mesopotamia, while individual settlements remained politically independent. Beyond this region, the degree of Uruk influence also varied greatly. At sites such as Tel Brak, the sudden appearance of Uruk material culture after a series of devastating fires is interpreted as a seizure of power by southern elites, but violent transitions following this model appear to have been rare. Instead, in many settlements, regional styles underwent a slow process of Urukization. In places like Nineveh in northern Mesopotamia or Arslantepe in southeastern Turkey, local elites seem to have imitated the decorative mosaic styles of the south, although generally only a small number of Uruk-style buildings are present there. At other sites, such as Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains to the east, Uruk artifacts and buildings may have been limited to a small enclave within a large local settlement. Finally, some contemporary Turkish sites, such as Kenan Tepe, show no signs of Uruk-style buildings or pottery at all, despite their presence in neighboring settlements. In light of this uneven picture of influence, a number of archaeologists have suggested that the spread of Uruk culture was driven less by military expansion and more by the desire of its elites to gain access to goods available in these distant regions, such as timber, precious stones, and metals. These theories often emphasize the perceived scarcity of these goods on the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, where they were necessary to maintain Uruk's complex social hierarchy and monumental construction practices. While the lack of resources in this region may be exaggerated, luxury items such as gold, silver, and lapis lazuli were indeed only available outside Mesopotamia. Thus, it is argued that many of these colonies were actually Uruk trading enterprises that could fund independent merchants and colonists with the long-term goal of expanding access to exotic goods. There is also no reason to believe that these colonies were limited only to Uruk. Some may have originated from other cities of the alluvial plain. Finally, one cannot rule out the possibility that some of these enterprises were not connected to the elites of the time, and could have been the initiative of individual colonists in search of new opportunities or agricultural land, So how exactly did the Uruk elites track the vast amounts of tribute and trade goods flowing from both local areas and the extensive trade network? We have already examined the stamp seals and cylinder seals of this era, and how they were used to confirm ownership of individual goods and transactions. But while these seals were certainly an important part of administration and correspondence, they could not contain information about the objects themselves to which they were attached. To provide such information and ensure proper accounting of property and supplies, a completely different tool was required. As with many other signs of complex societies, the emergence of writing appears to have been the result of a long period of development, during which several competing accounting systems were used simultaneously. One of the earliest systems was small tokens made of clay or stone that represented a specific commodity or product. Later, these tokens began to be placed inside hollow clay spheres known as bullae. These spheres were marked with the cylinder seals of their owners, ensuring the contents remained secure. While this system was effective for accurate accounting, it had a disadvantage. The bullae themselves had to be broken to check their contents. To solve this problem, two approaches emerged. First, people began to press the tokens themselves into the clay of the bulla before sealing it, leaving a visual identifier of the contents. Around the same time, separate solid clay tablets containing lists of numbers began to appear in Uruk and other centers. While these numerical tablets are useful for tracking the exact quantity of goods, they do not contain information linking them to the items they refer to. However, it is in the later layers of the Uruk period that we begin to see the emergence of an accounting system that combines each of these elements. This system consists of a script known as protocuneiform, which may well be the first in human history. It consists of simple signs inscribed onto the surface of soft clay tablets with a reed stylus. Stick. Samples of such tablets, dating to the second half of the 4th millennium BC, were found in the inner temple quarter. Later, this script apparently spread to other centers of southern and central Mesopotamia. In its earliest forms, some of the signs inscribed on these tablets are recognizable as pictograms, for example, the signs for barley, bowls, or running water. Others, however, seem to have been chosen arbitrarily. For instance, the sign for sheep or goats is a simple circle with a cross inside. The vast majority of these tablets, it appears, were used for simple bookkeeping, recording the receipt and distribution by the temple of goods, such as beer, barley, and textiles. The remaining 10% or so constitute categories of related words, known as lexical lists. These tablets apparently played a key role in training new scribes, and contained lists of professions, names, animals, objects, and weights and measures, which were frequently copied by apprentice scribes. This new system was a massive innovation compared to preceding forms of accounting, but as a writing system, it had several problems. For a start, protocuneiform had no real system of grammar. Signs were not recorded in the same order as in spoken language, and it seems that at the time, the idea that writing could represent speech did not yet exist. In addition to the lack of grammar, protocuneiform also used a staggering number of symbols. In the earliest tablets, more than 900 signs have been identified, the meanings of which all users had to understand for the system to function. This huge array of symbols not only made learning the language difficult, but many of its signs have no equivalents in later writing systems, making their meaning unclear to modern scholars. Adding to the complexity is the fact that the earliest protocuneiform tablets contain several different systems of recording and counting. For example, if a scribe was tasked with recording individual items, such as animals, slaves, or dried fish, he used a system with increments of 6 or 10 units. However, if the items represented a quantity of something, such as a volume of processed grain or dairy products, he also used an increment of 2 units. Yet another system was applied when measuring volume or surface area. The sequence of units also varied, and while many individual sign shapes remained constant, the exact values they represented differed depending on the system. As a result, Scribes of the time had to simultaneously track about 60 different numerical signs to fully understand their accounts. This cumbersome system soon became more sophisticated. Over the following millennium, the number of signs was reduced to about 600, while the surviving symbols gradually became more abstract. At some points, each symbol was also rotated 90 degrees, meaning that the script was now read from left to right, rather than vertically. Elements of grammar were gradually introduced, and the signs were codified over time, losing many of their pictographic features in favor of more abstract wedge-shaped signs. Finally, one of the original characteristics of protocuneiform, the lack of a link between the writing and a specific spoken language, allowed it to remain a common script for millennia, because the symbols were used to represent individual concepts rather than sounds. The same system could be applied to different languages. Ultimately, more developed forms of cuneiform served as the script for several languages over the next 3,000 years. First, it was used to record Sumerian and Akkadian in the 3rd millennium BC, and then alternately for Ramite, Hurrian, Hittite, and Luwian, and beyond its use as a tool of bureaucracy. This new system also represents a major conceptual breakthrough for humanity. For the first time, humans were able to organize and record the world around them, write their own names and thoughts, and later record mythologies that had clearly evolved since the earliest days of humanity. Despite all the utility of writing, we must recognize that its inclusion in the list of main criteria for civilization is perhaps the least indisputable. Indeed, throughout world history, many civilizations have emerged that did not use writing in the same bureaucratic function as in Uruk, in China during the 2nd millennium BC. For example, writing was used more for ritual purposes. Characters were inscribed on animal bones and turtle shells as part of the divination practices of the Shang dynasty kings. Other complex societies, for example in West Africa, also existed for centuries without any obvious form of writing at all. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that this writing played a key role in the normal functioning of temple economies during the peak of this era. Furthermore, cuneiform would play a key role in subsequent centuries as a tool of correspondence within and between states across the region, acting as a primary tool of diplomacy. So, we have examined the types of structures, economy, and bureaucracy characteristic of Uruk at the end of the 4th millennium BC. But who exactly stood at the head of this society? In the popular imagination, Mesopotamian societies are often identified with the kings who ruled them in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. However, at present, we have no clear evidence for the existence of a sole ruler throughout both the early and middle Uruk periods, which remain poorly understood. There is also little evidence for the presence of royal palaces from that time, and the monumental buildings of this period seem to have been limited to the temple quarters. However, when it comes to late Uruk, the situation becomes a little clearer. It is during this period that power appears to become increasingly centralized. At the very top of the temple hierarchy, one useful document from that era has come down to us, shedding light on the political structure of the time. It is a protocuneiform tablet, known as the Standard List of Professions. This list, which appears to have been used to train scribes, was faithfully reproduced across the Near East until the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, and contains a hierarchy of professions dating to the late Uruk period. Unfortunately for us, many symbols in its earliest copies are unknown from later cuneiform documents. This also applies to the symbols associated with the first 5 positions or professions in the list, making it difficult to interpret the exact leadership hierarchy of the late Uruk period. Fortunately, besides the written sources of this period, we can turn to other resources. To understand the highest positions, we can again glean information from the Walker vase. In addition to the scenes of offering agricultural products to the Temple of Inanna, its upper register contains a missing section that hides the identity of one of the participants. This missing part has been reconstructed based on similar Uruk-era iconography, and it is now believed that a person resembling a chieftain or priest was depicted there. This figure, whom scholars usually call the En or the priest king of Uruk, is distinguished from other characters in the symbolism of the period by a full beard, a headband, and a net skirt. Besides the depiction on the Walk of Ace, statues of him have been found, and his figure appears in a wide variety of scenes on cylinder seals. In these scenes, the priest king performs a wide range of religious and military roles, including feeding temple herds and capturing prisoners and slaves. His image even appears on a knife handle found in distant Egypt, where he is depicted alongside a pair of lions in the Master of Animals motif. Because of his paramount role in Uruk iconography, it is believed that it is this figure who is represented by the first symbol in the standard list of professions, and much later translations indeed equate this term with the Akkadian symbol for king. Despite this equation and his prominent role in iconography, we know little about the political or ritual functions this figure performed during the late Uruk period, as the protocuneiform tablets found do not contain details about the political life of the city. As for the remaining entries in the list of professions, we can infer from parallels with later documents that these officials may have acted as heads of various sectors of the temple economy, as evidenced by titles such as Leader of the Plough or Great One of the Lambs. So, here we have the elite of Uruk society, but what about the other end? What was the life of ordinary people like in southern Mesopotamia at this time? As for the city itself, it seems that most people were involved in crafts and professions related to the production and distribution of materials required by the temple system. Judging by our standard list, these professionals included gardeners, potters, jewelers, cooks, smiths, and weavers among others. It is difficult to say how independent each of these people was. One theory holds that many of these workers already depended on the temple system for survival, receiving fixed rations in exchange for their labor. It is known that such a system existed throughout the 3rd millennium BC, when temple workers were issued rations in the form of barley, oil, and cloth. A number of early tablets found in Uruk indeed detail the distribution of grain to workers, indicating that a similar system likely operated during this period as well. Some scholars have even suggested that the abundance of Uruk's characteristic beveled rim bowls, found discarded in temple quarters, is explained by their use for measuring a fixed quantity of ration for each worker. The protocuneiform symbol for ration also resembles these bowls, further indicating their possible purpose. And in addition to these workers, we also know from protocuneiform inscriptions that part of the labor force consisted of slaves. Outside the complex hierarchy and specialized division of labor observed in Uruk itself, life apparently remained more egalitarian. Here, the landscape consisted of smaller villages and towns, the majority of whose residents were farmers. People here likely own their own lands and herds, though they may also have paid a portion of their goods and income as tribute to Uruk itself. With the exception of local temple officials, there seems to have been little social distinction between the residents of these villages. For them, society continued to function much as it had in the region since the beginning of the Ubaid period. The land still had to be tilled, crops had to be harvested, and life still depended on all the calamities that the natural world could bring. In comparison, workers in the cities may not have possessed the social freedom of these farmers, but their needs were provided for in the form of fixed rations. The climate of Mesopotamia apparently became significantly drier during the Uruk period, which could have complicated village agriculture. This may explain why more people were drawn to the cities throughout the Uruk period, where life may have been less free, but perhaps also less uncertain. Finally, in Uruk, we have found a state that meets all the criteria of civilization set out at the beginning of this series. Here, for the first time, we see a permanent agricultural settlement of unprecedented size, which relied on a hierarchy of smaller towns and villages, and exerted economic and cultural influence far beyond its borders. Unlike the large settlements of Italic or Ain Ghazal, whose dwellings were relatively uniform in function, in Uruk and other settlements of this period, We see evidence of specialized zones, such as temple quarters, production centers, and both ordinary and elite residences. All of this was managed by a complex bureaucracy that the residents developed according to local needs. This culminated in the invention of writing, which facilitated first administration and then diplomacy between the states of Mesopotamia in the millennia to come. Finally, at the top of the social hierarchy, we find a recognizable elite who directed society toward achieving their own goals, such as the acquisition of resources from northern Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau. The Uruk world system came to an end at approximately the turn of the 4th millennium BC. The exact reasons for its collapse remain unclear. Many archaeologists attribute it to another shift in the local climate beginning around 3200 BC, which led to extremely arid conditions throughout the Near East. What we can say for certain is that toward the end of this period, the city itself apparently underwent a major social reorganization. The complex temples of the inner district were demolished, and the area remained empty for some time before new centralized buildings were constructed. The Olu district also underwent dramatic changes around 3000 BC. A giant new terrace was built over the old structures, of which little remains today. Around the same time, a number of Uruk-style colonies, such as Habuba Kabira, were systematically abandoned by their inhabitants. Although larger population centers do not show a major break in population numbers or cultural continuity at this time, in the east, the city of Susa rapidly transformed into an independent city-state modeled after Uruk. Here, residents developed their own early writing system, known as Proto-Elamite, which remained in use for several more centuries. From this point on, Uruk's access to the trade of the Iranian plateau apparently ceased, as did its influence on sites in Turkey and northern Syria. In Mesopotamia itself, the beveled rim bowls characteristic of the Uruk period gradually disappeared, and the next 200 years were marked by the adoption of a new type of painted pottery. Around the same time, cities on the Mesopotamian plain declared their independence, beginning a long struggle for hegemony. Uruk would remain the largest city in Mesopotamia for centuries, but its influence would never again reach the heights it once knew. With the end of the Uruk world system, we also conclude our journey. From this point on, a new, urban way of life established itself definitively. In the coming millennia, fewer tools would be made of stone. They would be replaced by a new material created by smelting copper with tin. With the appearance of these bronze tools and weapons, we enter a new period of world history. It is in this period that we first learn the names of ordinary people and rulers. It is then that the first great works of literature were created, and the structures of the world's first organized religions are revealed to us. This is also an era of wars, warring city-states, and jealous rulers. In the coming millennia, the first world empires would grow from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia, only to collapse one after another. In this new era, rulers would seek divine approval for their actions and strive to expand their power to all four corners of the world. But before all of this, there was summer, the battlefield of kings. Hello everyone, this is Charles. I just wanted to thank you for watching the video to the end. Before I go, I want to express my gratitude to a couple of archaeologists who helped me in the creation of this video. Dr. Jeff Emberling and Dr. Augusta McMahon, who were the directors of the excavations at Tel Brak in northern Syria. You can check out more of their work in the comments section, where I have listed all my sources. Thank you to everyone who has already supported us there.